War doesn't erupt with just a single bullet. It doesn't begin the moment tanks cross borders or when cities fall under fire. No, war starts long before that. It begins with words, carefully crafted, sometimes weaponized, with centuries of unresolved history echoing in the present, with old scars that never fully healed and long-standing grievances passed down from one generation to the next. It begins with a slow, almost imperceptible rise of tension, like a storm building over distant hills, until one day the skies break open. And today the world is witnessing one of the most brutal and consequential conflicts of our time, the Russian invasion of Ukraine. But to call this simply a war misses the deeper truth. This isn't just a battle for land. It's a struggle over identity, memory, and destiny. It's about an empire trying to reassert its grip. It's about a sovereign nation fighting not just for its territory, but for its very right to exist. It's about a people who have faced centuries of conquest, oppression, and denial, and who now stand defiantly, refusing to be erased from history. In this documentary-style deep dive, we're not just going to look at tanks and timelines. We're going to uncover the full story, the layered story. We'll trace the roots of this conflict back through centuries of rivalry between East and West, between czars and revolutionaries, between ideologies and empires. We'll explore the legacy of the Soviet Union, the heartbreak of the Holodomor, the bitter split after the Cold War, and the turbulent uprisings that shook Kyiv. And ultimately, we'll arrive at the moment the world held its breath, as Vladimir Putin's forces surged across the border, reigniting a fire that had been smoldering for generations. This is not just the story of a war. It's the story of a nation's resistance, a fight for survival, a testament to courage in the face of overwhelming odds. This is the untold story of Ukraine's fight for freedom. Chapter 1. The Historical Roots. The Birth of Kyivan Rus. Long before the towering spires of Moscow pierced the northern sky, long before the idea of Russia even existed, there was Kyiv. Nestled on the banks of the Dnieper River, it wasn't just a city, it was a thriving political and cultural hub, a beacon of power and prestige in Eastern Europe. This was the heart of Kyivan Rus, a medieval federation founded in the 9th century by Viking warriors, known as the Varangians, who intermingled with local Slavic tribes. Kyivan Rus wasn't just a kingdom, it was a crossroads, a place where East met West, where trade routes from Scandinavia, Byzantium, and the Islamic world converged. It became a melting pot of cultures, languages, and ideas. And in 988 AD, one of the most pivotal moments in the region's history unfolded. Prince Vladimir the Great, ruler of Kyivan Rus, made a decision that would ripple through the centuries. He converted to Christianity and ordered the mass baptism of his people. This act wasn't just religious, it was political. By aligning with the Byzantine Empire, Vladimir bound his realm to the Orthodox Christian world, establishing cultural and spiritual ties with Constantinople rather than with Rome. This choice would define Ukrainian and Russian identity for the next millennium. But while Russia would later claim Kyivan Rus as its origin story, Ukraine sees it differently. For many Ukrainians, Kyiv is not the ancestor of Moscow, it is the mother of Ukraine. But as with all empires, Kyivan Rus could not escape the cycle of rise and fall. In 1240, a catastrophe struck. The Mongol horde under the command of Batu Khan descended upon Kyiv. In a storm of fire and destruction, the once mighty capital was reduced to ashes. Its churches collapsed, its citizens were slaughtered or enslaved, and the golden age of Kyivan Rus came to a brutal end. In the aftermath, the political center of the Slavic world fractured. The surviving nobility, scholars, and warriors scattered. Some fled north, retreating into the dense forests of Muscovy, a relatively obscure principality that would later evolve into the Russian Empire. Others stayed behind, clinging to the battered soil of modern-day Ukraine. But their future would be far from peaceful. What remained of Ukraine became a contested frontier, a vast open land caught between rising powers. It was ruled, re-ruled, and redivided. Poland, Lithuania, the Ottoman Turks, and eventually the Tsars of Moscow all tried to lay claim to it. And through every occupation, every forced allegiance, Ukrainian identity refused to vanish. It survived in folk songs, in oral traditions, in resistance movements, and in the hearts of its people. So when we talk about Ukraine today, we must begin not in 2022, but over 1,000 years ago, in the golden halls of Kyiv and the blood-soaked streets left in the Mongol wake. Because the roots of this conflict were planted long before any modern border existed, long before any modern nation declared its independence. They were planted in conquest, in resilience, in a history that is anything but simple. The Cossacks, Ukraine's first warriors. By the 1600s, Ukraine had become a land of survivors, scarred by centuries of invasions, fractured by empire, but never fully conquered. And from this rugged soil, a new force rose. Not kings, not knights, but Cossacks, fierce, freedom-loving warrior farmers who would become the soul of Ukraine's resistance. They weren't born in palaces. They didn't wear crowns. The Cossacks lived on the wild steppes and riverbanks, far from the courts of kings. They were hunters, horsemen, and rebels, men who valued liberty above all else. And in time, they formed their own autonomous state, the Cossack Hetmanate. It was a loose, self-governing republic led by elected war chiefs known as hetmans. A state forged not by diplomacy, but by defiance. But freedom was fragile. Ukraine was still caught between two giants, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth to the west and the rising Tsardom of Russia to the east. The Cossacks fought both at different times, rebelling against Polish nobles who tried to Catholicize and control them, while also resisting Moscow's growing shadow. Yet in 1648, a turning point came. A charismatic leader, Bogdan Khmelnytsky, rallied the Cossacks into a powerful uprising against Polish rule. For a time, it looked like Ukraine might finally be free. But surrounded by enemies and desperate for support, Khmelnytsky made a fateful choice. In 1654, he signed the Treaty of Pereyaslav, seeking protection from the Russian Tsar. It was a decision made in desperation, but one that would echo with regret for centuries. The Russians promised brotherhood, protection, and partnership, but what came instead was domination. Bit by bit, Moscow tightened its grip. The autonomy of the Hetmanate eroded. The Cossack leaders who resisted were imprisoned or executed, and the proud history of Ukrainian independence was rewritten by Russian hands. The campaign didn't just happen with swords, it happened with words. Ukrainian language was pushed out of schools and official documents. Kyiv's legacy as the birthplace of Eastern Slavs was claimed by Moscow. Even the name Ukraine was diminished, replaced with the label Little Russia, a term meant to reduce, to absorb, to erase. Still, the spirit of the Cossacks endured, in songs and stories, in the blood memory of a people who had tasted freedom and would never forget it. The Soviet era. The 20th century arrived not with hope, but with revolution. The Russian Empire fell, and from its ashes rose a new power, the Soviet Union. It promised equality, unity, and a classless utopia. But for Ukraine, those promises would be broken almost immediately. Ukraine had briefly declared its independence during the chaos of World War I and the Bolshevik Revolution. But it didn't last. By the early 1920s, Soviet forces had crushed Ukrainian resistance and absorbed the republic into the USSR. From then on, Ukraine was no longer a nation in its own right. It was a satellite, a province under Moscow's control. But the true horror began in the 1930s under Joseph Stalin. Obsessed with industrial growth and centralized control, Stalin saw Ukraine not as a partner, but as a resource. Its fertile farmland, the black soil of the steppes, was the Soviet Union's breadbasket, and he was determined to squeeze it dry. When Ukrainian peasants resisted Stalin's forced collectivization, when they refused to hand over their land, their livestock, their grain, Stalin retaliated with a cruelty few in history have ever matched. He sealed the borders, confiscated the harvest, and sent in troops to take even the seed grain. What followed was one of the darkest chapters in Ukraine's history. The Holodomor, literally death by hunger. From 1932 to 1933, millions of Ukrainians died, not from war or disease, but from state-engineered starvation. Parents buried children, entire villages vanished. Some historians estimate the death toll at 4 million or more. It wasn't a famine caused by drought, It was a deliberate policy aimed at crushing Ukrainian nationalism and resistance once and for all. And when the world turned its gaze elsewhere, Stalin turned his attention to erasing the evidence. He banned discussion of the famine, he censored journalists, he imprisoned intellectuals and artists who dared to speak out. For decades, the Holodomor was a silent wound, buried under layers of Soviet lies. But Ukraine did not forget. The memory of the famine lived on in whispered stories, in hidden diaries, in the unspoken grief passed from one generation to the next. It became part of Ukraine's identity, not just a tragedy, but a symbol of survival. A reminder that even when faced with annihilation, the Ukrainian spirit endures. Chapter 2, The Breaking Point. 1991, Independence at last. The year was 1991, and history was about to turn on its head. The Soviet Union, once an empire that stretched across continents, was coming apart at the seams. Protests erupted across the republics, economies collapsed, and statues of Lenin, once untouchable, began to fall. For Ukraine, this was more than a political shift. It was a resurrection. After centuries of domination, by czars, by commissars, by foreign empires, Ukraine declared its independence. And this time, it wasn't just a declaration written on paper, it came from the people. Over 90% of Ukrainian citizens, including a majority in Russian-speaking regions, voted yes in a national referendum. The message was clear. Ukraine wanted to chart its own course. The scenes were unforgettable. Tears and laughter, hugs between strangers, old women clutching yellow and blue ribbons as church bells rang out across the land. Ukraine had broken free of Moscow's orbit. For the first time in modern history, it was a sovereign state in the eyes of the world and in the hearts of its people. But in Moscow, the reaction was colder, quieter. While Boris Yeltsin and the new Russian government publicly accepted Ukraine's independence, a different sentiment simmered beneath the surface. In the minds of Russian hardliners, Ukraine wasn't a nation. It was an accident, a tragic mistake born from the chaos of the Soviet collapse. To them, Ukraine wasn't just any republic. It was the spiritual and cultural heartland of the Russian world. Kyiv, where Rus had been born, where Orthodoxy had taken root, was not a foreign capital. It was, in their eyes, an extension of Russia itself. And the idea that this land, so rich in history, resources, and symbolism, would drift westward, it was unthinkable. So while the world celebrated Ukraine's independence, resentment took root in Moscow. Not immediately, not openly, but like a fault line beneath the surface, the tension was there. And one day it would crack. The nightmare hadn't ended. It had just entered a new phase. 2004, the Orange Revolution. It started with a vote, but quickly turned into a battle for the soul of a nation. In 2004, Ukraine stood at a crossroads. The presidential election that year was supposed to be the country's moment of democratic maturity, but instead it became a showdown between two visions of Ukraine, one tied to the Kremlin, the other reaching westward toward Europe. On one side was Viktor Yanukovych, Moscow's favored candidate. Backed by oligarchs, state media, and Russian political consultants, he represented a future where Ukraine remained within Russia's shadow. On the other was Viktor Yushchenko, a reformer with a pro-European vision, one who believed in transparency, freedom, and an independent Ukrainian identity. But something was wrong. The election results, riddled with fraud and manipulation, declared Yanukovych the winner. Millions of Ukrainians knew their vote had been stolen. And in that moment, the cold streets of Kyiv came alive. Thousands, then tens of thousands gathered in Independence Square. Wrapped in orange scarves, the color of Yushchenko's campaign, they stood shoulder to shoulder in the biting winter air. What began as a protest turned into a movement. People camped in the square for weeks, singing, praying, chanting, refusing to leave until the truth prevailed. What made this uprising so powerful wasn't just the numbers, it was the spirit. Old women brought food to strangers, priests led prayers on stage, musicians played guitars in the snow. This wasn't just a protest, it was a peaceful revolution, and in the end, they won. Under international pressure and sheer public determination, the courts ordered a revote. This time it was clean, and Yushchenko emerged as the legitimate president of Ukraine. But victories in Ukraine often come at a price. In the Kremlin, humiliation turned to bitterness. To Putin, this wasn't just a lost election, it was a foreign-backed coup, a Western interference in Russia's backyard. And he never forgot it. The Orange Revolution had proven something dangerous to the Kremlin, that Ukraine was willing to rise up for its freedom, and from that day forward, Russia began plotting its revenge. 2014, the Maidan massacre in Crimea's theft. It felt like déjà vu, but this time the stakes were even higher, and the consequences far deadlier. By 2013, Viktor Yanukovych had returned, not as a candidate, but as Ukraine's president. Despite his promises of reform, it soon became clear whose side he was truly on. The country had been preparing to sign a historic agreement with the European Union, a long-awaited move toward integration with the West. But at the last moment, under pressure from Moscow, Yanukovych backed out. The betrayal hit like a punch to the gut. Young people, students, grandmothers, they poured into Maidan Nezalezhnosti once again. But this wasn't 2004. The mood was darker. The government responded with riot police and tear gas, hoping to crush the movement quickly. It didn't work. The protests grew. By winter, hundreds of thousands filled the square. They built barricades, organized food supplies, and sang the national anthem every night. The world watched as a people once again stood up, not just for Europe, but for dignity, for justice, and for Ukraine. Then came February 2014. The turning point. Snipers appeared on rooftops. Without warning, they opened fire into the crowds, unarmed civilians, medics, students. Over 100 people died in a single day. It became known as the Heavenly Hundred. The world watched in horror. And Yanukovych? He fled, packed up and vanished, slipping across the border into Russia under cover of night. Ukraine had rid itself of a corrupt leader, but it was not free, not yet. Because just days later, Putin made his move. Under the guise of protecting Russian speakers, masked troops without insignia appeared across Crimea. Airports were seized. Government buildings were occupied. Ukrainian soldiers were surrounded, cut off, disarmed. The world hesitated. Russia moved fast. Within weeks, Crimea was annexed by force and declared part of the Russian Federation. The reaction from the West? Sanctions, condemnations, speeches, but no military intervention. Russia had taken land, European land, by force, and nothing stopped them. And as the world debated, a second front opened. In Ukraine's eastern Donbas region, armed groups appeared overnight, declaring independence from Kyiv. Russian volunteers and weapons poured in. Checkpoints popped up. Cities fell into chaos. It wasn't declared war, but it was war all the same. Ukraine was now fighting a war on two fronts, against an old enemy hiding behind new tactics. Putin had mastered the art of war without declaring it. The invasion had begun, but it was only the beginning. Chapter 3, 2022. The invasion that shook the world. Day 1, shock and terror. February 24th, 2022. 5 a.m. The world changed. In the still, frozen darkness before sunrise, millions of Ukrainians were jolted awake, not by alarms or the morning sun, but by the sound of explosions. Missiles lit up the sky over Kyiv, Kharkiv, Odessa. Airports, military bases, and communication hubs were hit in rapid succession. Within hours, Russian tanks rolled across the border from the north, south, and east. Putin called it a special military operation. But make no mistake, this was war, full-scale, unprovoked. And as it began, the whole world watched in horror and disbelief. Many believed Kyiv would fall within days. Some thought Ukraine would collapse by the end of the week. Putin believed he'd take the capital in 72 hours. After all, Russia had overwhelming numbers. Thousands of troops, armored columns, air support, cyber capabilities. The odds seemed insurmountable. But what the Kremlin didn't count on was the heart of the Ukrainian people. In those first terrifying hours, Ukrainians did not run. They stood their ground. Mayors refused to leave their posts. Civilians blocked roads with trucks, buses, even their own bodies. Ordinary people made Molotov cocktails in apartment courtyards. Pensioners lined up to volunteer for territorial defense units. The world watched, stunned, as a nation rose with one voice. We will not be conquered. And then there was President Volodymyr Zelensky, a former comedian turned wartime leader. Offered evacuation by Western allies, he responded with words that would echo across history. "I need ammunition, not a ride." That one line became a rallying cry. He stayed in Kyiv, recording messages from the street, standing shoulder to shoulder with his cabinet. His voice steady, his resolve unshakable. The world, once hesitant, began to rally. Sanctions were issued, weapons flowed in, aid arrived. But on that first day, February 24th, 2022, it was Ukrainians alone who held the line. Against tanks, against bombers, against the darkness. Putin had launched a war to erase Ukraine from the map. Instead, he awoke a nation that refused to kneel. The Battle of Kyiv, as the thunder of artillery drew closer and Russian tanks crept toward the capital, Kyiv stood on the edge of collapse. The roads into the city were flooded with refugees heading west. Mothers carrying children, men saying final goodbyes. The skyline was filled with smoke. Everyone expected Zelensky to disappear, but he didn't. Instead of hiding in a bunker or fleeing in a convoy, President Zelensky did the unthinkable. He stayed. He walked the streets, filmed himself in front of government buildings, his eyes tired, his voice calm. And then came those 7 words that would electrify the world. "I need ammunition, not a ride." With that line, Zelensky became a wartime icon. His message was clear. We're not leaving. We're not surrendering. Across Kyiv, civilians became defenders. Teachers, baristas, athletes, engineers. They took up arms. The Ukrainian army handed out rifles to volunteers. And in neighborhood courtyards, Molotov cocktails were brewed in soda bottles. Entire blocks turned into barricades. And then there were the farmers. In an almost surreal twist, rural Ukrainian farmers began stealing abandoned or disabled Russian tanks using tractors. Videos emerged online showing tractors calmly towing multi-million-dollar war machines across fields. It was absurd, it was defiant, and it became a symbol of Ukraine's unbreakable spirit. As Russian troops advanced from Bucha, Irpin, and Hostomel, they faced a wall of resistance. The streets became kill zones. Convoys were ambushed by javelin missiles and barricaded roads. The infamous 40-mile Russian convoy toward Kyiv? It stalled, ran out of fuel, and became a target for Ukrainian drones. By early April, the tide had turned. Russia retreated from Kyiv. Their elite units withdrew in defeat. The capital stood, battered but defiant. But the victory came at a terrible price. As Ukrainian forces liberated towns north of Kyiv, they uncovered the unimaginable. Bucha, Irpin, Bordianka, streets littered with bodies, mass graves, civilians shot with hands tied. The joy of survival was smothered by the horror of what was left behind. Kyiv had been saved, but Ukraine had entered a darker chapter, one defined not just by invasion, but by war crimes. And still the people did not break. Bucha, Mariupol, and the war crimes. There are moments in every war where the line between combat and cruelty disappears. For Ukraine, that moment had a name, Bucha. When Ukrainian forces retook the town after Russia's retreat from Kyiv, they walked into silence. Houses stood abandoned, cars burned out. And then they saw the bodies, civilians strewn across streets, some with hands tied behind their backs, some shot in the head, many left to rot in the open. This wasn't war. This was a message, a warning, a campaign of terror against civilians, designed not just to kill, but to humiliate, to break the soul of a nation. As the images from Bucha surfaced, verified by satellite, journalists, and investigators, the world reeled in horror. The UN called for inquiries. Leaders condemned it as a war crime. Survivors told stories of house-to-house executions, of women violated, families tortured, children orphaned overnight. But Bucha wasn't alone. In the south, another city became a symbol of resistance and suffering, Mariupol. Once a thriving port city, Mariupol was surrounded, besieged, and cut off from the world. Electricity gone, water gone, food scarce. Russian bombs fell day and night. Apartment buildings crumbled. Hospitals were hit. Even a maternity ward was targeted, sending shockwaves across the globe. And then came Azovstal, a sprawling steel factory turned last fortress. Deep underground, Ukrainian fighters, doctors, and civilians took refuge in bunkers carved from concrete and steel. For months they held out, surrounded, outgunned, outnumbered, but not broken. Azovstal became Ukraine's modern Alamo, a legend of endurance and sacrifice. Children were born underground. Wounded soldiers refused to surrender. And through encrypted messages, fighters sent final goodbyes to loved ones. Not with fear, but with pride. Eventually, the defenders surrendered, not to survive, but to save the wounded civilians inside. Many were taken prisoner. Some have never been seen again. What happened in Bucha, in Mariupol, in Azovstal, wasn't just destruction, it was atrocity. It was a reminder that this war isn't about territory, it's about erasure, domination, submission. But Ukraine chose to fight. Chapter 4, The World Responds, the Economic War. Wars today aren't fought only with bullets and bombs. They're fought with banks, computers, oil barrels, and currencies. When Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine, the West didn't send troops, at least not directly. They responded with something far more devastating than a stern condemnation. Economic warfare on a scale the world hadn't seen in decades. Within days, the ruble tanked. Stock markets in Moscow closed. Banks were blocked from SWIFT, the international banking system. Russia's foreign currency reserves, nearly $300 billion, were frozen. Oligarchs, once untouchable billionaires with palaces in London and villas in Italy, suddenly found their yachts seized and their assets blocked. But Putin wasn't without leverage. Russia had something Europe needed: gas. For decades, Europe had become quietly dependent on Russian energy. With the turn of a valve, Putin weaponized winter. Pipelines slowed, then stopped. Gas prices surged. Homes across Europe dimmed their lights. Governments scrambled for alternatives. It was an invisible war, one fought through thermostats and electric bills. And while missiles rained on Ukrainian cities, another battle raged in silence: cyberspace. Ukraine's army wasn't just on the ground, it was online. A network of hackers, coders, and digital freedom fighters launched cyber attacks on Russian ministries, television stations, and propaganda networks. They leaked troop movements. They shut down official websites. They even infiltrated the Russian military's logistics systems, delaying fuel deliveries and communications. This wasn't just about data, it was about truth. As Russia poured lies into its media, calling the war a liberation, denying civilian deaths, Ukrainian tech warriors pushed evidence, videos, satellite images to the global stage. They turned smartphones into weapons of truth. And for once, the world listened. The economic war wasn't clean, it wasn't visible, but its impact was colossal, reverberating through stock markets, global alliances, and living rooms in every continent. And it was just the beginning of a global reshaping, one that would redraw the map of power in the 21st century. NATO's dilemma. For NATO, the Russian invasion of Ukraine was the kind of moment they had been created for, a direct threat to European peace. And yet, this was no ordinary crisis. It posed a nightmare scenario. How do you stand up to a nuclear-armed aggressor without plunging the world into World War III? The answer wasn't sending troops to Ukraine, it was to arm them to the teeth. Within days, the alliance swung into action, not with soldiers, but with weapons, intelligence, and money. Anti-tank missiles, drones, air defense systems, satellite data. Everything short of actual combat boots poured into Ukraine from across the West. It was a lifeline and a warning. But even as the alliance held its line, something unexpected happened. It got stronger. For years, NATO had been accused of losing relevance. Now, it was expanding. Putin had claimed his war was to prevent NATO's encroachment. Instead, Finland and Sweden, longtime neutrals, rushed to join. Finland, with its massive 800-mile border with Russia, was especially symbolic. Sweden, with its powerful navy and advanced tech, added muscle to the alliance. Together, they flipped the strategic map. Russia's worst fear, encirclement, was becoming reality. And still, NATO walked a tightrope. Too much support, and they risked escalation. Too little, and Ukraine could fall. Behind the scenes, NATO generals ran war games. What if a missile straight into Poland? What if Belarus jumped in? Every scenario ended with the same haunting question: how far was too far? So they walk the line. Support without provocation, help without confrontation. But all the while, the stakes were rising, and one misstep could trigger the unthinkable. Chapter 5, The Future, the Stalemate. By 2024, the war had become a meat grinder. By the time the war dragged into its third year, the tone had shifted. No longer a lightning war, no longer a shocking invasion. It became something colder, slower, more brutal. A war of attrition, a meat grinder, where every meter gained cost blood, where the price of holding a village was often hundreds of lives. Russia began throwing everything at the front lines. Not just professional soldiers, but convicts, teenagers, conscripts pulled from villages thousands of miles away. Some had no training. Others didn't even know where they were going. Just names on a list. Fodder for Putin's war machine. And yet, despite it all, Ukraine endured. Its troops, though exhausted, kept advancing. One trench at a time. One town at a time. They cleared minefields by crawling through them. They captured enemy tanks and sent them back into battle. They fought with grit, with clever tactics, with everything but what they truly needed. Because for all their courage, Ukraine faced a cruel reality. They were still fighting a 21st century war without 21st century weapons. No F-16s, no long-range missile systems to strike deep behind enemy lines. No Iron Dome to shield cities from drones and missile barrages. So the question loomed, can Ukraine actually win? Not survive, not hold the line, but win. Push Russia out, reclaim every inch of land, Crimea, Donbas, the cities flattened by shellfire. It wasn't just about weapons. It was about willpower, unity, endurance, and time. And time for Ukraine was a double-edged sword. The longer the war lasted, the more Western support risked fading. Elections changed governments, budgets tightened, new crises emerged. Ukraine needed help now, before fatigue turned into indifference. And yet, for all the doubts, all the suffering, all the uncertainty, Ukraine still believed. It wasn't just about territory. It was about identity, about proving that they were more than a pawn in someone else's empire. That they would not kneel, not to the Tsar, not to the Soviets, not to Putin. 3 possible endings. Scenario 1, Ukraine wins, a nation reclaimed. The dream of every Ukrainian family, every soldier in the trenches, every child born under air raid sirens, a full victory. In this scenario, Ukraine pushes Russia out entirely. Donbas, Luhansk, even Crimea. The country reunites, free and sovereign. The West celebrates. NATO is strengthened, and Putin? He falls. Either to an uprising or to his own inner circle. But this path comes at an immense cost. Years more of fighting, massive foreign support, and unrelenting sacrifice. And even then, it doesn't guarantee peace. Scenario 2, a frozen conflict, the forever war. It's the bleak middle ground. No victory, no surrender, just a ceasefire. Ukraine holds its west. Russia holds its east. A line drawn, much like North and South Korea. 2 nations staring at each other across trenches, snipers watching from both sides. The world calls it peace, but for those who live it, it's still war, just without headlines. A future where tensions never die, and another flare-up is always one misfire away. Scenario 3, Russia escalates, the doomsday path, and then there's the darkest door. Desperation. Escalation. A cornered Putin with nothing to lose. What happens if conventional war isn't enough? Chemical weapons, tactical nukes, or strikes on NATO territory designed to split the alliance? In this nightmare, the war doesn't stay in Ukraine. It spreads, and the world edges closer to the unthinkable. But here's the thing. We're not there yet, and maybe, just maybe, that means there's still time. Conclusion. Why this war matters. This isn't just Ukraine's war. It's a war for the rules of the modern world. Can borders be changed by force? Can one man redraw the map because he doesn't like what it shows? Because if the world lets Ukraine fall, what's next? Taiwan? The Baltics? Anywhere someone powerful decides the past gives them the right to conquer the present? This war is about more than land. It's about truth, about a people who refuse to be erased, who speak their language, fly their flag, and bury their dead with dignity. No matter how many missiles fall, because history isn't written by tyrants. It's written by those who stand when they're told to kneel, by those who speak when silence would be easier, by those who choose freedom, even when it costs them everything. If you're interested in exploring more about history, check out the links in the description below. I've included some carefully selected books, historical collectibles, and fascinating memorabilia that you might enjoy. Every purchase through these links helps support the channel at no extra cost to you. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.